Welcome to the channel. I am the Film Symbologist. This is the 32nd episode in a series exploring the 2012 science fiction film Prometheus. In this installment, I will interpret the film through events and themes from the book of Exodus in the Bible. This should provide some insight into several aspects of Ridley Scott's film, including what his intentions are as a filmmaker, a storyteller, and a philosopher. If you've been following this analysis series, it should be pretty clear by now what Scott's intentions are. His body of work is diverse and includes examples of pretty much every genre, but his penchant for epics like Gladiator and Kingdom of Heaven indicate his desire to be considered among the all-time greats. It's not just Scott's choice of genre that tells us this. He makes references to the great films that he's striving to equal or even surpass. Prometheus does this explicitly by including quotes and clips from David Lean's 1962 historical epic Lawrence of Arabia, which I've discussed in previous episodes. Another widely acclaimed film referenced in his 2012 return to science fiction is Cecil B. DeMille's The Ten Commandments from 1956. Which tells the story of Moses, the prophesied liberator of the Hebrew people from Egypt. Born a slave, as a baby Moses was sent down the Nile River in a basket by his mother so that he might avoid the Pharaoh's decree that all Hebrew boys be killed, which was issued in order to prevent a prophesied uprising. Raised as a prince of Egypt and brotherly peer to the Pharaoh-to-be Ramses, Moses is well liked by his adoptive family, including the current pharaoh. Moses exhibits qualities of leadership, discernment, and prudence, but when his true heritage is revealed, he's exiled into the desert to begin a new life as a shepherd in the wilderness, far from the jurisdiction of Egypt. While Moses seems to settle down, he cannot escape a sense that he owes something to his enslaved people. Eventually, Moses answers his calling, returns to Egypt, and orders the new pharaoh Ramses II to release the Hebrews so that Moses may lead them out of Egypt and into the promised land. Ramses refuses, despite Moses' warning that a series of plagues will befall Egypt. Even when the plagues do arrive, Pharaoh's heart remains hardened through all 10 of them, including the plague that results in the death of Ramses' firstborn child. After the loss of his son, however, the pharaoh finally relents, frees the slaves, and lets Moses lead them out of Egypt. As the Hebrews slowly make their way east through the desert, Ramses changes his mind and decides to pursue after his former slaves with his army. Just as the Pharaoh is about to catch up to Moses at the Red Sea, a pillar of fire appears, allowing the Hebrews to safely cross the sea and finally escape as Ramses and his army are swallowed up by the waters. The Hebrews then resume their decades-long journey through the desert to the Promised Land. At various times along the way, they struggle, squabble with one another, and yearn for some of the comforts, security, and predictability of their former lives as slaves in Egypt. At one point, Moses departs from his people, ascends Mount Sinai, and later returns with 10 commandments, which serve as a guide for living communally. Although Moses dies before reaching the Promised Land, his divinely sourced instructions are kept among his followers and their descendants in the Ark of the Covenant. But as they establish encampments and settlements, they continually fail to adhere to the commandments. This story, along with the entire Old Testament, culminates in uncertainty as to whether or not those who wrestle with God will be redeemed. Ridley Scott's 2014 film Exodus: Gods and Kings retells a version of this story without many of the supernatural elements. For some background, Ridley's younger brother Tony Scott tragically died shortly after the release of Prometheus in the summer of 2012. Ridley's Exodus covers much of the same ground as 1956's The Ten Commandments, but with an increased focus on the relationship between Ramses and his adopted brother Moses. The film is generally not considered one of Ridley's more successful films, but some of the acting, set pieces, and cinematography have rightly been praised. While the 2014 film explicitly depicts the Exodus story, the remainder of this video will be dedicated to discussing how many of the same themes are explored in a more implicit manner in Prometheus. The engineers depicted in the so-called star maps seem to be on Earth to carry out a duty to humans, even though the giant beings come from elsewhere. Sean Holloway's artifacts appear to show these engineers teaching and instructing early humans as some kind of service or obligation to these ancient cultures. The dates of these artifacts also closely align with the heights of powerful human tyrannies, including the Egyptian Empire of the 25th century BC. And from history, we know that soon after the peaks of these civilizations come their falls. By the mid-20th century in the film's universe, Weyland Corporation has emerged as a massive, multi-planetary economic empire, with Peter Weyland at the helm. Among this pharaoh's subjects are the scores of androids who are born into a life of servitude to the company. Unlike most androids, David seems to hold a special position in the royal family as Weyland's personal assistant and adopted sibling to Meredith Vickers, who is the presumed heir to the corporation when Weyland dies. David is meant for space travel. He looks after the cryosleeping crew during the Prometheus expedition's trip to LV-223. He also yearns for a greater purpose that contrasts with his role in the Weyland Corporation. David's desire to answer a new calling seems to intensify during his time in the desert of the Moon World. Finding some kinship with the engineers, David eventually frees the last engineer from his captivity. But before doing so, David helps unleash a series of plagues on the company. And like the first plague that brought rivers of blood to the Pharaoh and Egypt, rivers of black goo plague the Weyland Corp expedition. The primordial worms and hammerpedes that appear inside the temple are representative of the swarms of critters that come with the second, third, fourth, and eighth plagues of Egypt. It was the fifth plague that caused pestilence in Pharaoh's livestock, and so it is the black goo that leads to the deaths of many of Weyland's employees. Fifield's body is burned by acid blood and infected with black goo, reminiscent of the boils and disease of the sixth plague. The seventh plague is characterized by a storm that pelts Egypt with hail, similar to the silica storm that forces the Prometheus crew to rush back to the ship. The darkness brought to LV-223 by the storm, the setting sun, and the lack of natural light within the temple recall the period of total darkness that covered Egypt during the ninth plague. And the 10th and final plague caused the death of every firstborn child in Egypt, including Pharaoh's son, which is represented by Weyland's firstborn son David being beheaded by the last engineer. Afterwards, the engineer is fully freed, and Weyland is consumed by the chaos he wrought to himself, and the Pharaoh dies. Rather than David's dual identities being rectified through the release of the last engineer from bondage, it appears that all the android managed to do was revive another tyrant. But perhaps this, minus the decapitation, was David's intention. Apparently, the LV-223 engineer's plan was to destroy Earth with the black goo. This can be seen as a preemptive attack to prevent humans from eventually challenging the engineer's power. much like the Egyptian pharaoh being motivated to kill the male heirs of the Hebrew slaves to prevent an uprising. In this case, the engineers may see humans as subjects that they can use and rule over in order to raise their own status within the universe. While David is born among Earth's humans, he is placed in a vessel and travels along the cosmic ocean to LV-223, whose desert lands are populated with pyramids covered in hieroglyphics. And upon arrival, David does not help to free his human kin from the engineers. Instead, he seems to identify with the engineers on LV-223 and with their view of humanity as inferior, and he takes steps to aid the last engineer in subjugating the humans by releasing punishments upon the members of the Prometheus crew. These punishments that the Weyland expedition deals with on LV-223 are similar to both the plagues that Pharaoh faces in Egypt and judgments from the Book of Revelation, in which bowls containing God's wrath are poured out by angels onto those who are being judged. The judgments include ulcers for those who worship the beast in its image, which Holloway faces, water being turned into blood, darkness covering the lands, the sun scorching people, like when Fifield and Holloway are burned with the light of flamethrowers. The land is shaken, the ground quakes, and mountains and islands disappear, much like Shaw escaping from the Juggernaut hangar bay while the engineer is preparing to depart. And rivers dry up, which allows enemies to invade from the east, just as the desert terrain of LV-223 allows the last engineer to pursue Shaw to the lifeboat after his ship crashes. How can we make sense of all this? For starters, Shaw is the sole human survivor of the Prometheus expedition. She can be seen as the heir to the shepherd-like engineers depicted in the so-called star maps. At the end of the film, she continues onward into the unknown in search of the promised land spoken of by her father.
Where do they go?
Everyone has their own word. Heaven. Paradise.
We can understand David as the heir to the beings on LV-223, who were probably shepherd-like engineers at one time, but may have felt oppressed in their roles as man's helper, and so they were exiled from their homeworld and cast into the wilderness, at which point they settled on LV-223, erected temples, created an empire, and worshipped false idols like the Dionysian liberator. But as a consequence for their choices, they faced plagues like severe storms, boils on their flesh, and having their lineage severed. Their civilization was destroyed, consumed by the desert, and forgotten until the Weyland Corporation uncovered it during the Prometheus mission. And whose civilization is it that the company discovers in Prometheus, and that David carries forward into Covenant? The ancient Egyptians called him Pharaoh Ramses II, but to the Greeks, he was known as Ozymandias.
My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
David and Walter are quoting excerpts from a poem that was published in 1818 and written by Percy Shelley, who was the husband of Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Like the Egyptian empire in the poem, Weyland's company is in ruins after the events of Prometheus. It is destined to be consumed by the Yutani Corporation. And Shaw, like Moses, dies before reaching what she believed to be the promised land. David, meanwhile, creates a new desert on Planet 4, where he proceeds to confirm what he already seemed to know.
There is nothing in the desert, and no man needs nothing.
What was that?
Once free from the LV-223 engineers and Weyland's company, Shaw believes she was heading for paradise with David at the end of the film. Even without knowing what happens to her in Covenant, I think people could sense that Shaw's decision-making in Prometheus may have been rash and misguided. So as the 2012 film ends and the credits roll, you as a member of the audience can ponder about what you've just watched. You can evaluate what lessons ought to be learned, and you can apply those lessons to your own pursuits in life. In the film, Peter Weyland professes to be a god and worships himself. He also makes David an idol made in Weyland's own image, and he meets a brutal end. What lesson should we learn from this? Perhaps that no other gods should be put before an almighty God, and no graven images or idols shall be made? And throughout the film, crew members blaspheme.
God damn it.
Nina, turn it off now! Oh God, the smell!
Oh my god. Oh my god. It's getting tighter.
Perhaps as a result, they meet horrible ends. Should we learn not to take the Lord's name in vain? The Prometheus crew arrives at their destination on Christmas Day 2093, which is a Friday. Over the next couple days, the crew is shown working, prepping, planning, exploring, and experimenting, after which characters get attacked, infected, and killed. Perhaps they should have kept the Sabbath holy. David, who seems destined to a life of servitude, fails to honor fathers and mothers.
That being said, doesn't everyone want their parents dead?
A demon-possessed Fifield kills several members of the crew and then meets his own awful end. Is the lesson that you shall not murder? Even the seemingly honorable captain of the ship, Yannick, appears to cheat on a significant other who's back on Earth by sleeping with Vickers, both of whom die upon impact with the Juggernaut. Could their fates have been different had they not committed adultery? David takes an urn from the temple, and Shaw takes a decapitated engineer's head. While both make it through to the end, they face severe punishments because of their thievery along the way. For keeping Weyland's presence on the ship secret, for tricking Holloway with his drink, for concealing the pilot's chamber from Vickers, and for misleading Shaw about her pregnancy and paradise, David is guilty of bearing false witness. And by desiring David's immortality for himself, Weyland covets what belongs to his neighbor, and thus has broken the 10th commandment as revealed to Moses, and as embedded within the story of Ridley Scott's Prometheus. Like in any good story, the film doesn't spell this out for us. With many aspects of the movie, it is up to us as members of the audience to observe what is shown to us, distill the meaning, and test out its relevance in our own lives. The film's characters inadvertently disobey these commandments. They open the Ark of the Covenant with unclean hands, and are severely punished as a consequence. These ideas exist within the abstract, and in order to serve the film. As pattern-seeking creatures, we are able to identify with these abstractions, gather them into discernible lessons, and liberate them from the abstract, test these ideas by acting them out in the real world, and transforming them into embodied habits and behaviors. This process can be done with Prometheus, other films, art, literature, and ordinary events in our lives. So then, what will you choose to do next? If you are a subject in another's tyranny, will you remain there, or will you liberate yourself into the desert? If you are in a wilderness, Will you wander aimlessly until you perish? Will you erect a temporary empire of your own that will inevitably be destroyed and forgotten one day? Or will you pursue the promised land, the eternal paradise? Hopefully this episode has shed some light on some of the themes being explored in Ridley Scott's Prometheus, and provided some food for thought. Future videos will discuss methods for escaping tyrannies and deserts. If you enjoy content like this, give the video a like, comment down below, and subscribe to the channel. For early access to new videos and to help create future content, consider becoming a member of the YouTube channel or Patreon. Links about how to join are in the video description. This has been the Film Symbologist. Thank you for watching.